Thank you for joining us for another edition of Unspoken Conversations with Candace. Season 3 is dedicated to male survivors of sexual abuse. Our host is Candace Sanchez. Our guest today is Jon Vaughn, and my name is Neil Parekh. I am the co host. Candace, we are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and my personal website. In fact, we're live on two Facebooks, mine and yours, and two YouTubes, both of our YouTube accounts as well. Um, Thank you for trusting us with season 3 of your podcast. It's been an incredible joy to work with you.
Neil, I can't say thank you enough. I think with Digimentors, partnering with you, being the co-host, this journey, healing is a lifelong process. And I think doing this journey with you by my side, from the beginning, almost to the end, it's just been very rewarding, therapeutic. And so I'm just so grateful. I've been living this year in the attitude of gratitude. And so I'm excited for our guest, Jon, to share his story. And, we kind of talked a little bit about Jon, about how we feel we have a celebrity
Yeah,
in our
yeah.
midst. I mean, just because of the important work that he's doing and all of the media attention. And, when I saw him on Dr. Phil and watching that a couple of different times, I was very moved. I mean, I literally, I cried full of emotion of just because of how hard it is to be out there in
Sure.
the public eye, but really, really excited to have Jon on today the show.
Absolutely. This is another live broadcast, and I love the fact that we're going live. We did a series of pre-recorded shows, and now we've done several live shows. It brings a different energy to the event, and for folks who are watching, first of all, everyone watching on replay, thank you for watching. And if you're watching, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, please comment, let us know where you're watching from and share this with your friends. Let them know about the important conversation that we're having. Uh, Before we dive into things, we're going to share a few quick announcements from Candace, and then she'll come back on and introduce our guest.
Welcome to Unspoken Conversations with Candace, where we talk openly about taboo topics in order to spark difficult and uncomfortable conversations, where we allow a safe place for anyone who has had trauma to be heard. Unspoken Conversations with Candace is about speaking your truth by using your voice because you matter. Each season on my podcast has its purpose, and for season 3, it is dedicated to all male survivors. I want to express my sincerest gratitude and acknowledge Jeff Chugum. He was curious to learn more about my podcast. Once I explained my vision for season 3, he wanted to help. Thank you, Jeff, for your sponsorship and support. Special thanks to Jesse Daso for assisting in the planning, logistics, and helping to invite guests for season 3. And last but not least, Neil Parekh, my season 3 co host. Neil arranged to have Digimentors produce the show on a pro bono basis. Digimentors is helping me step out of my comfort zone by implementing video production. This form of media stream will be available broadly via our social media and our websites. I am extremely grateful to work with Neil and Digimentors. If you are interested in a high quality virtual or hybrid event, I encourage you to reach out to Digimentors. They work with nonprofits, higher education, corporate partners, international organizations, and others. It does not matter where you are based or how big or small your business is. They also do social and digital consulting, training, workshops, videography, recruitment, and more. Check out the links in the show notes for their contact information. Trigger warning. Before we begin, I want to make you aware that we are going to be talking about some very sensitive issues. All of our guests are male survivors of sexual assault. They will be sharing very personal stories about rape, incest, sexual abuse, and or assault. Please take a moment and make sure you are in an appropriate place to watch and or listen. Some of the descriptions may be explicit and have the potential of bringing up a range of emotions. It is more than okay for you to hit pause and come back to this later if you find that you need to.
Thank you, Candace. Um, so, as we were mentioning earlier, before those announcements, we have a very special guest for this month's episode. Can you tell us a little bit about Jon?
Yes, so I'm very happy to introduce Jon. So Jon is a father, survivor, I'd say thriver, author, and advocate. He serves as a board member for the National Foundation to End Child Abuse and Neglect. Jon is also widely known as an award winning college and professional athlete who played for the University of Michigan and in the National Football League with the New England Patriots, Seattle Seahawks, Kansas City Chiefs, and the Pittsburgh Steelers, concluding his professional career in the NFL in Europe. When over 1,000 people sued the University of Michigan for sexual abuse perpetrated by a doctor on faculty spanning several decades, Vaughn was one of the very few to do so publicly, making it clear that he is Jon Vaughn, not John Doe. He has been among the most courageous and outspoken critics of his alma mater and has served as an unwavering champion of survivors. And let's welcome Jon to the show.
Jon, thank you so much for joining us. Right before we bring you on, I just want to give a quick shout out to a friend of mine, Apollo, who is watching from a drizzly Philadelphia. He's saying hi to us as we get going. So, as I mentioned earlier, we are is a live show. Folks will be able to watch the recording afterward, but every now and then we'll share some comments on the screen as we go on. But Jon, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I look forward to diving into this conversation.
So Jon, I just, when we met, I met you last November at the retreat we had for the board meeting for the National Foundation and Child Abuse and Neglect. That was where we first were introduced to one another. And, we went around the room, we were doing introductions, and you shared your story there. And I immediately knew that I wanted you to be on my season 3, which was in the planning phases at that point in time. I know we briefly chatted about that, but for me to have this come to light and have this come to fruition, it just means so much to me. So just thank you for that and for agreeing to be a guest here today. And then I just have to say thank you because you attended the walk together here in Milwaukee. You supported as a board member as part of, I would say requirement, so to speak, but coming and having you here in the city of Milwaukee, supporting me as the event lead for the walk, it was just so great to have your support. So I just want to say thank you for being here.
No, it was an honor, and I really appreciated it. Like we were talking off camera, like being in a fight is kind of what fuels me. Um, Maybe I'm a glutton for punishment. I don't know, but that's where I feel, most at home.
hmm And I think we're all in this fight together, which is why, I wrote my book. I'm doing the podcast. When I meet another survivor, I've been using the word thriver quite a bit because we're still here. We're going through life, and not to say we don't
Right.
have our moments still, as I know we all probably do, which is the reality of it. I'm just so grateful and really that's why we're here is to start this conversation and really giving you, the ability to share your story, your story of what happened, when it happened, how it occurred and just anything and everything, So I'd like to turn it over to you, Jon, to share your story.
Wow. No, I so appreciate it. I think what would make most sense is we're almost going to talk real time and then go backwards. because I think it sets the stage of why I even, I guess, why I'm here today. So I was recruited to play at the University of Michigan, and there was a doctor, Dr. Robert Anderson, who was head of student health, as well as many years of his tenure was the head athletic doctor. That come to find out, literally 2 weeks after my 50th birthday, that the testicular cancer screening tests and the prostate cancer screening tests were one, unnecessary, and he had perpetrated that crime, if you will, for over 40 years. And then at the same time, finding that out, realized that the university had been embroiled in a sexual assault atrocity cover up for over half a century. And I think just the magnitude of that, once I got through the emotions of finding this out from one of my former teammates, the biggest thing that why I spoke out in the first place is I didn't want my daughters to find out that I'd been raped on ESPN. The University of Michigan football is a storied program. This year will probably be the first team to ever win 1,000 football games in college football. So it's a historic program. And then we've had historic coaches and historic players that have played for the university. But when I started digging deep into, one, how did this happen? How did this doctor, have this reign of terror, if you will, for over 40 years? You start to understand at the levels of power within the university structure that I also knew this was going on, how he was enabled, how he was empowered, how even seeing him was in some ways a rite of passage, because he was the gatekeeper to passing us for on and off the field injuries to practice. We were forbidden to see our childhood pediatrician for, once we stepped on campus at the university. And so, I think one of the first things that I heard also were I don't know if this is a word or not, but it was like we were being villainized. So the villainization of former student athletes for speaking their truth out about what had happened at the university and just telling our truths. I had never faced such scrutiny, death threats, slander for telling the truth, let alone at any other time in my life. I'd never, received such visceral hate and distancing from me, from different alumni, from different teammates, because, being asked, did I think, Bo Schembechler or other coaches knew? And I was like, well, how couldn't they know when they would brag about knowing everything that happened in the program? And then when the university spent $11.9 million in a investigation by a law firm out of DC that proved that over 24 plus individuals of power, including the legendary coach Bo Schembechler and the legendary athletic director Don Cannon, that they knew, and that there were so many victims of this doctor that to do this report, which was 270 pages, they had to stop counting because it was just too many victims. And so that acknowledgement of not only being a victim, not only speaking out against the university and how it empowered and enabled this sexual predator to literally have a reign of terror. I think he was at the university from 1966 to 2003. It really got me, you know, to thinking about how did I get in that position, which, as many know, when it comes to trauma, um, we have to go back to, you know, the beginnings and what I say is like the genesis of our trauma to really understand how. You have to understand, I was 50 years old when I found out about Dr. Robert Anderson and what had been done to me, because at 18, I didn't even know what a prostate was. I just knew that my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer almost simultaneously to the same week that Les Miles, who was a coach at the University of Michigan, started recruiting me and came on my high school campus. And then when I went to my recruiting visit, I was asked how my mother's recovery was. And in my first exam with Dr. Robert Anderson, he said, going through my history and whatnot, he's like, I realize you have cancer in the history of your family, and we need to do these under the guise of medical treatment, testicular cancer screening exams and prostate cancer screening exams. And also, in the thinking about my everyday life at Michigan, which I hadn't done in 30 years, I started to uncover other traumas that I had in my life, which brought me back to, I was raped in second grade by an ex-student of my mother's. My mother taught in the worst neighborhoods in St. Louis, and there were often times where young women would have to prostitute themselves to feed their families. And so my mother would try to have different babysitters. And I grew up in a very abusive and oppressive home by the hands of my father. And I was a child that really never slept. And so, the first time that I was raped was after my father had gotten home, my mother and father had gotten home, and my babysitter told my dad that I wouldn't go to sleep. My dad beat me in front of her, and she used that in every subsequent babysitting time to force me to do things sexually to her. And then I had been, an older gentleman that was 4 to 5 years older than me, between 7th and 8th grade. Then I was raped for the second time, and violently raped at the threat of, if I tell anyone, I will kill your mother. And so I suffered being trafficked to other men in the St. Louis area by this gentleman, as well as forced to sometimes by himself or other while he watched. So going into Michigan, and which that trauma lasted until 3 weeks before my high school graduation. And going into Michigan, suffering the violent rape that I had suffered as a child, and the recruiting of, you're going to get the best medical care, the best training, the best food, the best living, the best coaches, playing in the best conference. I would have never thought that the doctor that we were told to trust and was one of the best would ever be raping me. And so I went through the re-traumatization of really unpacking all my life's trauma and came to realize that by the time I was 21 years of age, I had been raped over 100 times in my life. And 50 of those times came at the hands of Dr. Robert Anderson.
Jon, can I just say that it would have been, I mean, it's awful enough that what happened to you at Michigan. Um, but to hear about the childhood trauma and when you were older as well, going into high school, um, I just want to acknowledge that you're standing, not just standing, but you are a fighter. And you're, I mean, we put father, survivor, author, advocate based on your Twitter account, right under your name, but you're a fighter. I mean, to go through all of that and to still be standing and still be willing to stand up. I'd put this picture on the screen earlier of when you started talking about your experience about to the media. I mean, for so many people, the reaction to this kind of trauma is to shrink back and to go into a shell and not be able to. But you had a very different response.
I think a lot of it is, I mean, and I know we have limited time, but it was almost like speaking out in the fight was also this journey of healing, because I had to come to the realization that from kindergarten, when I experienced the first real, like, unnatural trauma growing up at the hands of my father, I began repressing and compartmentalizing most of my life. And so, my birth name is Jonathan Vaughn. But by the time I had gotten to kindergarten, and I just, at 53 began sharing this story. I created my two best friends, and their names were Hinka Hunka and Lagaminka. I have no idea where those names came from, but my mother, being a teacher, would come home and ask me how was school. And I would tell her that, I don't know, Hinka Hunka went to school for me or Lagaminka went to school with me because they looked just like me. And then as I got older and became more successful and celebrated in sports, people started calling me Jon Vaughn. And so I publicly lived as Jon Vaughn, and the attention was taken off of the scared, hurt child of Jonathan.
Wow.
So, two things happened after suffering in silence for 50 years is Jon Vaughn had become tired of the fight. And Jon Vaughn and Jonathan Vaughn really wanted to now live, because Jonathan Vaughn had existed for 50 years. And so, as scary and as, traumatic as it was to speak out, I mean, at 50 years of age, just imagine having your first panic attacks. And I think it can't be missed that as athletes, we're trained to compartmentalize. And being in a very abusive and oppressive home, I basically lived my entire life in a situation of constantly being uncomfortable. But sports, and especially football, I'm being trained to excel in the sport of organized chaos. So you have to learn to quiet the noise.
Sure.
And I heard this phrase about, actually being introduced to NCAN, louder than the silence. And I would tell people, I was like, I shattered the silence at 50, but that silence used to be loud as hell for me. And that really empowered me to speak up and to speak out, because I couldn't understand why there was such a hate for the truth that I was telling.
I want to share some kudos you're getting from Apollo, Helm Apollo Lee. You never know when what someone is going through. Much healing and peace for you. And then he endorsed what I said earlier. You're a real warrior, and you're amazing. Your response is a huge blow against the harm, and much respect. And that's certainly, he's speaking for all of us. I do want to acknowledge my mom is watching as well, from Hastings. She's been watching all of our episodes, but she's also a psychotherapist by training. And she is saying that she's glad you're able to unwind the story and help other people verbalize their feelings. It is very therapeutic to share these stories. And again, just a huge thank you for. I mean, it's very different. It's interesting because of the other guests that we've had, and Candace knows, and we've talked about this a little bit. Everyone is on a different at a different point in the journey, in the healing journey. Some people are at the very beginning, and this show, I'm thinking Michael Complincalaire, who was our guest, I think, back in June, if I'm not mistaken. That was the first time he had spoken publicly about his experience. Was on this show. We have other people who've given TED Talks, who've been on the Today Show, who have written books and plays, etc. And I know that it's not a linear process, but you're certainly, I mean, out there in terms of your story, in terms of the advocacy work that you've done. Certainly, probably one of the most advanced people on that journey that I can think of. Can you tell us a little bit about this image that we have on screen?
Yeah. So, my theory, or what I live by most in life, is I jump out of airplanes and I build the parachute on the way down. I don't know if that's an entrepreneur in me or an athlete. And this is the morning, my first morning. I went out to the campsite, I think it was October 8th in 2021 at 7 p.m. And this is the first morning at the campsite. Very rudimentary. Like I said, I had never camped in my life. That's actually the second chair that I had, because my first chair broke that night.
The first night?
First night, and it was actually raining, so I needed something to stay dry. But really, it was interesting because if you look in the background, you see that's actually the second night I was there.
So this is the first, you were saying, in the background.
This is the first morning. So I went out there at 7 p.m. Friday night. That's the Saturday morning that I was out at the camp. And then that picture that you just showed at night, that was the second night at, I want to say, around 2 o'clock in the morning. I couldn't sleep well that night. And as I'm walking around, I really just felt like this picture really symbolized one man's voice that for some reason, I just felt like this will be as small as the camp or the protest will be. Like, this is the infancy of what hopefully will change the safety and student safety on this campus, but potentially help. I've always been a person that shoots for the moon and fall amongst the stars, and I felt like we would change the world with this protest.
And that's in front of the house of the president of University of Michigan at the time, right?
Yeah, that's
They
right
were
in the
trying to
center of campus.
Neil,
hold him to account.
Yeah, Neil, can you go back to the other picture? Because the sign here, this hashtag me too, hashtag us too, hashtag we too, hashtag he too. Like John, when I
Yeah.
saw your picture and that message is just the strong message, which is again another reason why I'm doing this podcast, because as a woman, right, usually the males are the perpetrators, and there's this stigma against men, or the hate against the male perpetrators. But in this case, like I've learned through my own healing journey and being an advocate now, males, they need a voice. And so that's how Neil and I partnered up, is the fact that he was on a male panel discussion, and his call of action was to the women on that live stream. We did a webinar, live stream meeting last year, and then the rest is history. I mean, I told Neil, I'll dedicate a whole season. Let's talk, let's partner. We started planning, we put things in action. I mean, and here we are,
Yeah.
and when I hear you talk about it's the fight, I now understand. I recently took an advocate training and really now understand the laws, right? Having a better understanding. And let me tell you, John, I got mad. I got angry. And I'm like, I was violated more than 3 times. And when you told me the number of violations against you, and I thought about, it happens sometimes every day, nonstop for 6 months. And I'm thinking like, trying to count the number in my head, and I just got upset. So and pissed, like angry, just mad. And I remember someone else taking the advocacy course with me saying, "Why are you angry?" I'm like, "Because the adult Candace is talking to the younger Candace in my head saying, I'm going to do something
Right.
about this. We're going to now take action." And so now I'm happy to report that I have reported. I have gone to the Racine Police Department, and I have put down my abuse on paper, on record with the law enforcement, and honestly, they were like, "Well, what do you want to happen?" And I said, "Do what you need to do. Go through the investigative process. I'm ready for the fight. Whatever happens." And honestly, I'm expecting nothing, but whatever happens, whatever the outcome, I'm just proud of myself, because if they were to offend again, which I pray that they don't, but I don't know, right? And I pray that they don't, but if they do, that it's on record, and then hopefully something can be done going forward. So, just again, when you talk about the fight, I'm ready, and I hear you, and I see you, I believe you, all the things, those matter. Doesn't matter how long your trauma's been. Doesn't matter, if you never reported, you can still report and put it on record. And I'm just so happy that I can say that I'm doing that next step in the healing journey. So I just want to
No, that's
applaud you and
awesome.
commend you, because again, as I work with other survivors, talk to other survivors, we continue to inspire one another. And so you have been an inspiration to me, talking with you, just understanding your journey, what you've been through. And I look forward to when you publish your book, when you get on that next phase,
Yes.
and supporting you in
Yeah.
that effort. That's what we're here for, right? Me and Neil talked in our last episode about survivorship and how important that is. And I'm just so grateful. So thank you.
No, thank you. I think solidarity is um, often missed. I think, what came out of me speaking out is, from a cultural standpoint, it it you got through the stigmas of the African American taboo, or people of color taboo, and how they handled sexual assault and sexual violence. Now, let me qualify this. And I've talked to many, many survivors, thrivers, as well as victims over the last 3 years. Um, and this is why I'm ready for whatever fight. And I don't say this very lightly, but I was thinking about this the other day. I know what it's like to be raped by a woman. I know what it's like to be raped by a man. I know what it's like to be gang raped. I know what it's like to be forced rape by threat of my life, my mother's life. I know what it's like to be raped through a trusted organization. But I also know what it's like to have to meet your assailants that raped you as a child once you became a professional athlete or known in the community at events as you were that athlete, and them not even realize that they were raping you, and have had to re-traumatize myself because the Jon Vaughn professional image had to once again suffer in silence because that life that they had, you know, part of me that had died from those rapes, they didn't even realize that I was the person that they were raping. So I have this crazy perspective on what I call the spectrum of sexual assault and sexual abuse. And then I'm 53, and I just don't care anymore what you say or what you think of me. I have no shame. Yes, is it difficult for men to carry, as women, to carry the scarlet letter of a rape victim? Absolutely. But I'm also confident in who I am. And that goes back to, and I don't want this to be missed. My mother was a teacher. And I leveraged a conversation that I had with my mother in 1992, February of 1992. As we're going through this process with Michigan, we're doing, some protests, we're speaking out, but we weren't really getting anywhere. And my mother, who was a teacher, would get home at 3:50 p.m. By 4 o'clock, we were watching Oprah. And for some reason on this day, Oprah's shows Overcoming, and it's the first time my mother started telling me about protesting and marches in the civil rights, and how it wasn't just African Americans, it was whites and blacks and Asians and Hispanic and old and young and men and women, because it was a human rights issue. And then she proceeded to tell me how, I think it was my great 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 grandmother helped lead slaves to the Underground Railroad. And then as a 21-year-old, a month out of being 22, who's ready to go out and hang out with his friends because my season's over, she says to me one day, "You will be faced with something that's bigger than you, and I know you'll stand because that's the way I raised you." And I was at that point, it's like, okay, Mom, I get it, but you never know when a seed is planted, when it will actually sprout. And so my mother has since passed. And that was like one of the blessings of, at the time when I found out that this happened at Michigan, because my mother was really the last person that said, okay, you can go to Michigan, because of all that was promised, the education and so on and so forth. I knew it would break her heart to find out about this Michigan thing. And so channeling all that she had taught me really helped me to speak up and to speak out. And sometimes, and I think you all can, feel this, is like you get to talking about your story, and it's a very unconscious state where you just want to hopefully make an impact on someone you might not ever meet, because of the impact someone that you may never meet and their story did for you. It's not a conscious thing. It's not a scripted thing. It just happens where you never know where the lighthouse in the port in the storm is, because what I believe as a survivor of sexual assault, the system, the legal system, really society separates you and puts you on this ever shrinking island. And I also think it's a very dark highway, and getting out of the darkness isn't just, hey, I'm off this highway and I feel better. No, it's a process. And so you're always looking for those beacons of hope.
And you don't know which comment or what's going to make the difference, right? To me, it's having a, it's kind of like a drip 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 process. I The person that is a mutual friend of mine and Candace, Dawn Helmrich from Milwaukee. I heard her tell her story at a United Way conference where we both worked for United Way. Not the story. She made reference to the fact that she had been raped, and I kind of filed that away and made a point to introduce myself. Didn't disclose anything at the time, but heard that, and then I remembered distinctly when Judge Rosemary Aquilina, allowed the victims in the other case from Michigan. And I do my best not to name people. Respect, if you do or don't, but I always try and catch myself. But she let the victims speak, and that was so powerful to do that. And I actually had the chance to interview her on another show that we do, and get to know her and talk with her, which was just incredible. But that experience and in hearing others, that's what I have to hope, that these stories that we're sharing, someone might hear this story and it might not do it for them, but it might be the next story they're hear, or the next experience they have, and this might be a piece of their puzzle along the way. um I do want to bring in you know a comment. Sri Srinivasan, who is the CEO for the firm that we work with, Digimentors, says, "Thank you for your courage and leadership, John. Really grateful to hear you talk about this. Your speaking out is a beacon of hope for so many." Just the fact, and I want to give a personal shout out. When I first brought this idea to our team and said, "Hey, I want to work with Candace on this project for the year. I want to donate our time and our services to produce this event." There was not a moment of hesitation to do this. We do this for other clients, corporate and the UN and nonprofits and higher ed, but this was too important a conversation, too important an effort to even think twice. And so I want to thank my team for the support they've given, allowing me to do this. It's obviously a passion project for me as well, but um, we're just hoping that someone hears these stories and is able to connect.
And I want to just touch
Absolutely.
on the impact, right? So, me writing my book, you know, the podcast being a spin-off the book, meeting wonderful guests. I remember being into my season 2, and wondering, how am I gonna pull how is this does this matter? Is it making an impact? Does anybody care? Like, I kind of started doubting myself, doubting the importance of, if it, whose lives is it really touching? But then I said, Candace, stop focusing on the numbers, stop focusing on the download. The content is what matters, right? When someone needs to hear it, they're going to stumble upon it. Like, I believe in divine design. So I believe when someone's meant to listen, it's going to be there for them. And then, lo and behold, like I said, season 3 came to fruition when I attended, because one of my work meetings got canceled. I worked during the day, and my meeting that got canceled, I was like, oh my God, I can make the panel discussion for the male survivors. So I joined that one, probably 5 minutes late, but then boom, being able to listen to it, being able to hear Neil say call of action. And I just felt I answered that call. And then to know, like, season 3 happened and here we are. And I just, again, like, everything happens for a reason, divine design, the alignment, the appointment. This was all meant to be. And so I couldn't thank Neil Digimentors for offering their partnership and their collaboration, because this it matters. And so, John, again, just with you sharing your story, I was hoping we could kind of talk even just about, the mental health aspect. When did you've kind of unpacked a little bit,
Mm.
your healing journey began when you turned 50, and this is now brought to your attention. Now you're having to kind of go through everything from childhood on. Were there thoughts of suicide for you? Were there drugs involved? Like, when did you really, like, say,
No.
I need to address all that darkness?
So I think the interesting thing about most of our stories, as it relates to Dr. Robert Anderson, is we had to go back and look at the train wrecks in our life. And so at 50, wanted to understand why I'm having panic attacks, why I'm, I had always understood that the body keeps the score and how unresolved trauma will manifest itself at some point in time. Like chickens always come home to roost. But then I was actually given a book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
And so the one thing that and having to deal with very severe diseases, specifically cancer, so many different times with people that I know in my life, realizing that you had to go out and either burn or cut out cancer at its root. And so my healing journey really began when I started writing the book. And I didn't start taking these notes to write a book. I started taking these notes to understand the flood of emotions and the flood of memories that was coming back in my life. And it's almost like you start to, once your mind starts decompartmentalizing things, you start to now start putting the puzzle pieces together and realizing, oh, this was the train wreck because of this. And that forced me to go all the way back to my earliest trauma to see how that affected me at all these different stages of my life. And then, making the decision at 50, and I'm a golfer, so this is my golf resume. I finished the first 9 of my life. How is the back 9 of my life going to be? And what is my mentality going into it? And but I tell you what it did, there was a lot of pain, a lot of tears, but I also had a lot of joy in thinking about relationships or times where it's that interaction of that relationship helped get me off that train wreck or out of the dark. And so, because there's so much grief and so much shame as a survivor that really society puts on you. And I think the visceral hate for us men that were speaking out. And I had, one of the Ohio State victims, Dr. Strauss, which is another atrocity that they're fighting over at Ohio State, say to me, we're having this conversation. He says, Jon, you realize that, or in our conversation, we're both acknowledging that if wrestlers, football players, basketball players, hockey, men can admit that they've been raped, what does that say about completing the wheel of what sexual assault looks like? It does not discriminate. And there was a lot of opposition, especially with men, in re-traumatizing, not believing, trying to discredit us. And so it's like, if it doesn't kill you, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And then you alluded to it earlier, but I say it like this: God never calls the equipped. He equips the called. And so I feel like this moment in my life was written years and years and years ago, unbeknownst to myself. And I have been equipped with so many individuals like you, Candace, now you, Neil, this podcast, in so many different areas and because of technology, like the first time I spoke out in the first article, that same day I heard from a 16-year-old kid in Dubai.
Wow.
Who was ready to speak out against his rapist.
Wow.
And acknowledging that he could be put to death in that country, but in some ways he felt courage that day. And that just kind of threw me aback, because that's not why I really wanted to tell my story.
Sure.
There were so many things where the dehumanization and the marginalization, you've got to understand how humiliating, how traumatizing it is to be thought of as a Jane or John Doe, because the only other place in society, especially in the legal system, that Jane or John Does are attributed to human beings is when they're dead or they're cold cases.
Yeah.
And so you're going to take everything that I contributed, my teammates and other athletes contributed to the University of Michigan, and put monikers of Jane and John Doe on us, but yet still have this massive Goliath of a brand out trying to discredit us. And so there was also, you're taught as you rise through the different levels of sports, is you just don't want to be a number. You don't want to be what we would call a jag, which is just a guy. You want to do something that makes an impact for the greater good of the team. And so to know that we were being, faceless, nameless, voiceless victims, it was so disheartening for all that we had sacrificed for this university and for this institution. So that was the motivation at first. And then the scared, hurt Jonathan Vaughn really started coming to life. And what you realize after you suffer in silence for half a century, the lack of silence gives you so much peace. And it's hard to explain that to people. But suffering in silence is the loudest hell on earth. So that's where I say the fight gives me peace.
Yeah.
Because to thrive as a survivor, you have to be willing to fight for yourself.
Every day.
So Hinka
Absolutely.
Hunka, Lagaminka, Jon Vaughn could be put to rest in theory. I will never, I was blessed as an athlete, and it took me basically, around the world, saw more things than a fast black kid from Florida, Missouri ever thought he would see.
I
But
want
he
to
was always protecting Jonathan Vaughn.
I want to mention you talked about being an athlete. We showed the picture of you with Michigan. You were also in the NFL playing with the Patriots, the Seahawks, the Chiefs. It's a big deal. And having you step forward, I mean, this is the whole issue. And what happened, you'd mentioned Ohio State, and I immediately thought of Penn State. I thought of UCLA. I mean, they're these huge programs with these major scandals. The wrestlers. I mean, the idea that you know anyone can be a survivor. I'm not going to call you a victim. Anyone can be a survivor of this kind of trauma. Um, I do want to ask you a question. I know we're approaching the end of the hour. With your permission, if we can go a little bit longer. Um,
Absolutely.
Candace asked you the easy question. Did you ever, in terms of mental health, and you ever commit suicide, consider suicide? Um, I'm going to ask you, a different question. With all the trauma you experienced, you talked about your father. You talked about in high school, and obviously the doctor in Michigan. Um, Something that I've struggled with, and that we've talked to other guests about. Um, have you been able to forgive any of these people?
Oh my gosh, that's a very interesting question. I will quickly answer Candace's question. I never wanted to commit suicide, but I would do things that would be like, I was a general adrenaline junkie. to numb myself.
Mm.
And there were times where I would never kill myself, but I didn't care what I was doing, like racing stoplights on my motorcycle if it killed me. My father, my mother left my father in 2008 after 41 years of marriage with the clothes on her back and her purse.
Good
and
for
my
her.
brother and I took care of my mother for the last 3 years of her life. He had been starving her because she had Alzheimer's, dementia, and leukemia. My mother passed the day before my birthday in 2011. I stopped talking to my father maybe 3 years before my mother left him for self-preservation reasons, because he had threatened to kill my daughter in front of my mother over some green beans, but that's a whole nother story. And my father died in 2018. And I get a call from a cousin that I never met. But just, when I left Candace, after that Saturday, I played golf on Sunday in Madison. I went to St. Louis Sunday night. On Monday morning, because I had been having this dream where my mother's telling me, you need to go visit your dad's grave.
You're talking about this recently after the walk.
This was after the walk. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And I haven't published it. I want to publish it at some point in time, but I wrote this letter, this thank you letter to my father. But I ended that thank you letter with this. This is a close that, the visceral, like this is right off the top of my head. And I said, but most importantly, Dad, I want to thank you for all the suffering, which gave me the ability to have empathy and to forgive you. So I forgive you for all that brought me to this moment today. And I hope that you can rest in peace. And that was really the first time that, well, before then I said, because I lived my life hating you, which was like me taking a poison, hoping you to die. And so I thank you for finally being able to forgive the one person that I've hated for my entire life. And so that moment was probably the most freeing moment that I had lived through, because from a physical pain, I suffered through my rapes because I didn't want my mother being killed. There was always a compartmentalization aspect, but I never shut off my mind to the growing hard-hearted nature that I had against my father, and how Jonathan Vaughn lived behind the athlete, the strong person, but had never, you got to understand too, like a month in at the camp, I found out I had a sweet potato growing in the left side of my thyroid tumor and a golf ball growing in the right side of my thyroid. And then had an episode of where my body goes into shock during surgery after, like 4 days after the 100th day I was out there, where I didn't think I was going to make it. And coming out of that, I realized like unresolved trauma can kill you, like literally can kill you. And so I was having this dream like 3 times, the same dream within a week. And I was like, all right, I got to get on the road. And it just happened to be at the time of coming to the walk. And, I drove right from Detroit. I was on the road for like 3 weeks, but in that walk, Candace, it was so, I could just feel the scales and chipping away at how hard-hearted I had become, knowing what I was going home to face.
Wow.
And I truly believe if I had not gone to that walk and if I had not gone to dinner with you all the night before, I wouldn't have been able to forgive my father. Because I think the last mile on any journey is the toughest. And I wouldn't have been able to make that journey. And so I thank you for the timing of what literally saved my life. And I think, this was
just 6 weeks ago.
This was just 6 weeks ago.
6 weeks ago.
I mean, this is raw and fresh.
Yes. And that's the thing. You never, this is my belief, you never get over trauma. You just get through it. And you find these beacons of hope. You find these lighthouse in the dark, the port in the storms that help you get from darkness to light. Because there is no light in darkness, but there's a lot of darkness surrounded by light, if you understand that. Like, our darkness is dark. And so we're on this constant journey to find light. Right? And so I wouldn't have been so meticulous of the timing and the things that I did for these 3 weeks. And as I said, I built in days to golf. I went to Memphis. I had never been to Memphis just to make sure I golfed after I had to go back. Because like I told you, my mother said, write the last part of the book in St. Louis because that's where your roots are. So I then go to Memphis because I needed that day to see a golf course, because that's really the only time that no one calls me. Everyone leaves me alone. And I can have that mental health period to myself. And I can strategize about what's the next fight or whatever. But I would have never gone. I would have never. I mean, I say this as I'm sitting here today. If I hadn't had that conversation with Lori about the walk in Milwaukee and knowing that it was your walk, because I really wasn't, I was so much in the fight against Michigan, I hadn't paid attention. And she was like, can you come to the walk? And I was like, I'm in Detroit, I'm going to drive. And I started planning. But when I knew it was your walk, because of the excitement in November that you talked about the walk.
Yes.
I was like, all right, I'm there. But I also knew that I'm going to get something, because at the time that Lori's asking me about the walk, I'm having these dreams from my mom, and I'm doing everything I possibly can not to listen. Now, I don't want to go to my dad's grave. I don't want to forgive him. I don't want to let this go because I'm still hurt. And honestly, it was the last hurt that I had let go of, or I had to let go of. Yeah.
I think that's incredible that you were able to do that. I don't know whether the other folks in your life. I know for me, it was a neighbor that came to my door one day, and so we had just moved in. I was 7. He said I needed help with a Cub Scout project, and I said sure. And I didn't know what he was doing, and he proceeded to abuse me. I am so far from even thinking about forgiveness. It's something that it's been helpful to hear your story. I mean, God, if you can forgive your dad, I mean, who, anyone should be able to forgive anyone. I mean, it's just inspiring. Um, and to think about everything that you went through at University of Michigan, building on the earlier traumas and going through that fight, but it took those years to get to this point and to the walk and working with NCAN, and Lori was a guest on our show earlier as well, and as well as Kathy Studer from Columbus. Um, but it takes, like we said, it takes all of that work and all that effort to get to that point. Um,
And I just
Mhm.
I just want to add, so when John was here in the city of Milwaukee, I had family come up from Texas, San Antonio. They drove 1,300 miles and they're watching. Albert and Liz are watching. So thank you, family, for watching. But Albert and John connected like immediately.
oh, great.
And Albert does ministry down in Texas. So how can we get into the prisons? How can we talk to these men? How can we make a difference, right? So right away, collaboration was happening, and again, believing about divine appointment, divine design. And John, I'm glad that you shared that. I think forgiveness is huge. I know the first thing you got to do is forgive yourself because it wasn't your fault. It was
Yeah.
not our fault. None what
Right.
happened, and we are
Right.
so much more than what happened to us. We're so much more because look at us, all of us thriving. And yes, we have
Right.
moments, but we get out of those moments pretty quickly because we have tools in our toolbox to help us do so. And so I
Right.
just want to say,
Right.
I'm glad that you had that moment. I'm glad your mother was speaking to you in your dreams. I believe when they come and talk to you, it's coming from a real place and you need to listen. So
Yes.
I'm glad that you
Absolutely.
listened. I was able to get an I'm sorry from my abuser. I
Right.
I was in
Mm.
Racine. I lived in Racine. Um, Fred was meticulous about yard work and it was cheap labor, free labor. I would let him do my lawn, even though my doors were all locked. Sometimes my kids were there, they weren't there, but he was never allowed in the home. But one day he tapped on my back door. I was home alone. I let him in. I graciously walked backwards to the front of the door because I was still skeptical. I wasn't sure what. Yeah, I reverted back to that little girl again. Still respecting this elder who had violated, who had abused me, assaulted me for my whole, from 11 to 15. And so him sitting on the couch, me standing by the front door, and him telling me that he was sorry. I'm sorry, Candy. That's what he said to me, and I forgave him. And not every survivor gets that. And he left.
Yes.
He never told my mother, which it didn't matter to me at that point, But then through unpacking my own trauma was just what I think hit me this year, living in the attitude of gratitude, was I just had to really forgive myself. Through the book, through this podcast, is just understanding like I did not ask for this. This is not my fault. I didn't choose for this
Mm.
to happen to me, but I know I am so much more than that. And then what happened
Absolutely.
to me. So I'm just
Yes. Kudos.
so grateful,
Yes.
John, for you, for Neil, for the season, for what it stands for. Real quick question, John, did you happen to read my book, Unspoken? If you didn't, that's okay. I'm
I
just
have not
curious.
had a
Okay.
chance. It's in my to-do list actually, which is crazy. But I want to add one thing that you said about
Yes.
forgiveness. Is hurt people hurt things and broke people break things. And so I think that last journey that we're all on to basically forgive ourselves is because I think we do more self-inflicted wounds than anyone else could, especially as we're trying to recover from trauma. And I just think that's just a major, major step um, in that. So kudos to you for having the courage to forgive yourself, because I think that's probably the second most difficult thing than forgiving your perpetrator is forgiving yourself.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know we're coming up on kind of wrapping things up, so I just want to ask this final question, which then I'll ask Neil, but I'll start with you first, John. So my last chapter in my book is called Full Circle Blessings.
Mm.
And so what are you most grateful for?
That I made it out of the hospital when I had, 36 hours of, my blood pressure's at 250 over 150. And it had never been that high in my life. And
Mm.
There's three things that's going to happen. You're not going to make it out of this hospital because you're a higher stroke risk. You're going to make it out of the hospital and never be the same because you're going to have a stroke. But we're going to figure this out. I'm most grateful that they were able to figure it out. And I'm most grateful that it was doctors at the University of Michigan Medicine that saved my life, because that also gave me a comfort in that all doctors, because I had stopped going to the doctor before then. So I'm just grateful for life, like, in today.
Thank you. Neil, what are you most grateful for?
Candace, I am still overwhelmed. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that rises to this full circle blessing. But we've been doing this. I've been working with you for more than a year and a half, prepping the show, and then producing these shows since January. I'm just so grateful for the people that you've brought into my life. I'm behind the scenes and producing the show, and hitting the buttons and working on the technical aspects. But you did all the recruitment. You did all the identifying and talking with people, getting them to share their story. And to a person, it's just been an incredible learning experience. I joke, and one of the lines that I've been using, John, was that even if nobody else watches the show, and it was our very first guest got me to understand that it's not about the numbers. You don't worry about how broad this gets. People will see it when they need it. All right, they'll hear it.
Right.
But even more importantly, this has been like a grad level seminar for me personally, in helping me along this journey, and in learning from people like you and being inspired. And I just I can't be more thankful for everything that's come into my life, the strength it's given me to talk about this issue. um, I can see the growth in myself over the last year. You should ask Candace. I was a hot mess when we launched the podcast in January. I mean, you talked about earlier about your daughter. I So I had shared my story a little bit, in a few places, um, and you know, but I was going to go public in January with my story with this episode coming out. And so I wrote a blog post and I put it out on social media. And before I did that, I told my then 9-year-old daughter uh, that something had happened when I was younger than her. Because I didn't want her. She found my channel on YouTube. She knows how to. She knows how. She found my website. I didn't want her to find out on her own, and so I have a good talk with her, and you're trying to explain it to her in a way that she could understand. Um, but from that moment of sharing my story really publicly, written a blog post earlier, and did something on a smaller scale, to now it's just incredible. So really, I'm thankful for that. Um, I want to share a few more comments that have come in before we close. Apollo said, "Always be a survivor." That's powerful. And that hobbies, expressing care and support to others, these are all the tools of light. Thanks for sharing, and I'm glad to be here to support. Uh, John, you have made an impact, and you certainly have. My mom, again, is proud of the three of us, and she's been consistent. She's been saying that consistently, and that's an important. It means a lot. But she also said that I salute you, John, for your courage and determination to talk about the bitter experience of your abuse and assault. I think that is, hopefully for folks who are hesitant, who are scared about what's going to happen if they share their story. I know I got a lot of support on social media when I put out my piece, and I think that's really incredible. A lot of to have that kind of support. And I'm going to put this sign up from your protest. All the people who signed that board to support survivors. I think that's just indicative of kind of how you brought people together. So it's kind of a long answer this time, Candace, but there's just so much to be thankful for.
Yeah.
And your family offers their blessings and prayers as well.
Yes. And when I think about just again this year for me, 2023 has been living just in the attitude of gratitude. I'm just grateful that I am still living, that I have my health, that I have my family, that I have a community. This unspoken conversations with Candace is all about community. It's about breaking these barriers, this taboo topics, addressing your traumas, healing from the inside out. So for anyone listening, these stories are for all of us so that we can be brave and be courageous and step forward into the light, coming out of your darkness. That's a hard thing, but I'm grateful that it took a village, took people around me to believe in me before I really believed in myself that I could do this important work, right? And then now, as I'm aligning myself and doing the work, I took the advocate training, which really shifted my mindset even more to know, like, if I answer the phone to someone in crisis, how I can be of service, and if I need to go to the
Right.
hospital and help someone who's been sexually assaulted, how to be there and help in service, taking my advocacy step, one more step, to continue to help me be that support system for other survivors. And hopefully then they will find their voice and hopefully they will then know what's possible, after the assault. Cause a lot of times they're just in that mess. And, I've said this before, you take your mess and you turn it into, I've heard a good friend of mine, Jamal, mention this, you take your mess and you turn it into your ministry. You take your trauma, you turn it into triumph. You take your pain, you turn it into purpose. And I believe that's this whole journey has brought me to this point in my life. And I'm just so grateful. And thank you, Neil, for being my co host on this journey. Thank you, Jon, for being an amazing guest on season 3. Really appreciate both of you.
Absolutely. Apollo says these are all things to be grateful for receiving, and he shares your gratitude, Candace. Jon, thank you very much. It was an incredible honor to have you on our show, and we will continue the journey together now.
Absolutely. I so appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to share my story and hear yours as well.
Thank you, Jon. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Keep fighting the good fight.
We will.
Absolutely.
Yes. Together we are louder than silence.
Absolutely.